Hi, welcome to the 21st episode of Startups Rights. Actually, it's been a while. Today, my guest is Katya Putintseva. Is that the right way to pronounce?
Yeah.
Great. That's what I was going to ask. I forgot to ask. Welcome, Katya. Katya is the co-founder of Briefly Bio, and she's based in the UK. And we'll talk more about her company. But before delving into our company, I would like to ask a couple of questions about you, right? Like I've looked into your background. I know you have a PhD in molecular and computational immunology. You've done your data science master's and you've had other positions before, as co-founding the Briefly Bio. So I'm really interested in the path that led to Briefly Bio, right? Like, and I want to hear it in your own words. So please.
Oh, yeah, sure. I'll start with the idea behind Briefly Bio. I think it's quite simple. So if you think about science, it's quite a collaborative process, right? So the majority of experiments that are being run right now as we speak have probably been communicated to the person running them by somebody else, right? And yet the communication of science is done generally pretty poorly. And it's not to blame the people who are doing the job. It's just that science is so complex, and experimental science in particular. There are so many details, so much nuance. It's tough to write it up. It's also tough to read it. So we decided to build a tool that would do the job for people, right? So whoever needs to communicate what they did in the lab, whoever needs to document their processes that they run in their experimental setup, we build a tool for them. And for the backstory, so I spent about 7 years in academia, and I'll tell you a secret. I always hated reading papers. And don't get me wrong, I love science. I love discussing research with people, but reading papers, I never enjoyed. It always felt like they're getting in my way of understanding what the person actually did. And especially the methods section. Whenever I had to reproduce somebody else's experiment, it was not the best experience at all. So I wanted to do better with my communication. And what I usually do when I want to do something better, I go to the people who do it well. So I decided to take a communication design, like a couple of year degree beside my PhD. And the rumors spread about that. So people started reaching out to me. And later, my friend and I started a small studio where we were helping scientists and nonprofits to communicate their work better. But it wasn't scalable at all. So we could do only this much, right? So we were doing it on the side of our other jobs. And when I moved to industry, I thought, surely in industry, people have it all figured out, right? Surely industry knows how to communicate their stuff and they're all on the same page. But it turns out they didn't. It was the same story, right? Because the complexity is still there, and all of the processes graduate from academia because the majority of people have done their PhD into the industry setting. So in industry, I worked as a data scientist. I was working with the data that other people have produced in the lab, which basically means that I needed to understand what people did in the lab to do my job. It was a lot of fun, right? So you would get into these small seminar rooms and discuss with people what it was they did differently, etc. But as the company grew, it was becoming increasingly difficult to do that. And so I found myself scrolling through other people lab journal entries, trying to understand, why did the controls change? Why are they looking different this week than they did last week? And so when I left my previous company, it was quite easy to decide what I wanted to do. I basically wanted to go back to communication in science, and this time I wanted to make it scalable. And so we co-founded this company together with two other people that I worked with in my previous company. One of them also has a biology background and has struggled with science inefficiencies throughout his career too. And the other one is an engineer. So when he walked into biology, he did not know what he was getting into, right? So he did automation of lab experiments in the lab, and he needed to understand what people ran manually so that he can translate it into robotic processes. So there was quite a bit of communication there too.
That's really cool. One, I totally agree. I mean, I didn't like reading. I studied science. I studied biochemistry, not as much as you did, right? Like you have a PhD and all that, so you definitely know way more than I do. but I also did a year of research after graduation, and I was like, I don't think academia is for me, right? Like, I don't think I can really continue doing this over and over again. Um, so from what you mentioned, right, and it seems like a very universal issue. And it seems like it's a massive issue, and especially if you think about the industry, right, it probably costs the industry billions of dollars annually. I think I've read in one of the articles there was an interview with you in one of the articles, and you mentioned that it costs the biotech industry quite a bit of money to because of the inconsistencies. Um, so what I was thinking is that you were saying many companies or many people would trying to addressing it, right? So in your opinion, what have been the key barriers to solving this problem? Why not many people have attempted to try to do something about it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually think that a lot of people try to address it, and I think that lots of people are genuinely trying to address it right now. But the problem is that it is quite tough, right? Let's maybe run through like a metaphor here to understand why it is tough. Like, let's imagine you have a grandma, which you probably do, and you love her dumplings. And dumplings are probably quite a tedious process to prepare, right? And you loved her dumplings so much that you would like to cook just the same dumplings that she does. And so one day you would stop by her house and you would say, "Could you teach me to cook these dumplings that you cook for me?" Would that be difficult? Well, probably not too easy, right? Because probably the process is quite involved. At the same time, she'll be there to answer your questions. She'll be there to show you, clarify whatever you didn't understand. She'll also probably give you instant feedback. So maybe a couple of times, a couple of run throughs, and ta-da, you can cook similar dumplings to your grandma. Now, let's teleport ourselves into, I don't know, the year 1950. Don't know. There is no internet, basically. And one day your grandma announces she's going to move to Australia. And you're so shocked that you forget to ask her about the recipe. You forget to ask her to teach you the dumplings, right? So now you're sitting there writing a letter to her, asking her to send you a recipe back, and she does. Well, is this one going to be easy? And how easy is this one going to be, right? How many attempts will it take you to actually get it right? Probably a few back and forth. Let's go back to science now. Probably getting a little bit hungry. It's evening, right? Let's go back to science. So, as I said, the majority of experiments people run have probably been run by somebody else, and now, and then have been communicated to this person who's running the experiments. A few of those people will be lucky enough to have the actual access to the person they're adapting this experiment from. But the majority won't be. So the majority's grandmas will be in Australia, And so amplify this by the number of people there are in science, in all sorts of areas of science, in all different corners of science. And then imagine this Chinese whispers game, right? Where I say elephant and you in the other room say, did she say Fanning? I don't know. So although there are lots of different obstacles in making science reproducible, I feel like communication is the central one, because first you need to transfer the knowledge, right? It has to be the end of the thread that we need to pull. And that's what we want to do with Briefly. And technology has progressed quite a bit so that now we can actually implement the ideas that we have. So I think this particular solution hasn't been implemented previously because of the technology wasn't there before.
That's well. First of all, Katya, I will say this: you would have been a great teacher because your metaphors and analogies are very helpful in understanding these things. Thank you so much for that. And also, if I look to the side, I'm fully paying attention to you. Just my questions are on my iPad. That's why. Um, so Briefly Bios, right? AI-driven platform is designed, as you said, to capture these often overlooked details and that make experiments difficult to reproduce, right? So could you like share some examples of that? You come across in a typical scenario, and how your platform essentially tries to address and handle them.
Yeah, of course. I guess we have to dig deeper into why communication is so poor, right? So that we understand what needs to be fixed. So now let's imagine ourselves in a lab. And we are preparing, say, a protein expression. We've run it before, and so now we're changing just a few parameters because we want to maybe improve the yield of our protein. Let's say it's a GFP, because it's going to be easier with a GFP always. How much do you think we will write down, right? Probably only the things that we're going to change, maybe some calculations, but not much, because we don't have time. We have to step into the lab and start running these processes because it's late, it's 4 p.m., and we need to get home at some point. Do we know that the rest we will forget? Sure, we know that. But do we feel it? No, right? We don't feel that we're going to forget these details because we always think our memory is better than it actually turns out to be. And then we're surprised that, how could I have forgotten it? Am I getting old? No, it's just our memory is bad, right? So when we step into the lab, there will probably be some changes to the calculations. For example, I don't know, competent cells. We're running out of competent cells. So we had to recalculate everything and change the process a bit, not much, but a bit. Now we're done, it's 8 p.m. and we're thinking, okay, time to go home. I'm really tired. My partner is getting angry at home. I don't want to write it down. I know I should, but I don't really want to write it down. So maybe I'll do it tomorrow. And we don't write it down. And then if we work in a company, maybe a few weeks later, our manager will say, hey, Katya, it's been 13 write-ups. You should really do the job. Sit down and please do it for me because really it's getting late. And then I'll take a Friday off, or sorry, I'll take a Friday to work from home, right? I'm not going to be in the lab. I'll take a Friday to work from home. I'll sit down and I'll start my documentation process. It is tough and I'm going to type a lot. And the more I type, the less I'll know what it is I'm typing, right? Because text is getting in the way and there are so many parameters that I need to mention. I do know that I definitely need to mention the length of my heat shock because my supervisor always says it's super critical. But then there will be other details that my supervisor never talks about. So I'll forget about those details. And then fast forward a few months or maybe years, and it's time to maybe publish what I did. What will I do? I'll just copy paste my notes, clean them up maybe a bit, and off they go. And now the question is this going to be a reproducible experiment? Probably not, right? Probably when Javid is sitting on the other side of the world trying to reproduce my paper, he's probably swearing quite a bit and like trying to really understand what did she mean by wash? what does it mean? And so what Briefly does is it basically makes your process efficient and easy so that it doesn't feel like a chore. You don't have to come up with, your mental strength to sit down and document everything you did. Also, it helps you spot the parameters that you forgot. So, the heat shock you have, but maybe you don't have the temperature or you don't have the amount of bacteria, etc., etc. Also, it lets you stick to your guns. So you don't change your behavior that much. You still only write down the differences that you made. And it takes care of the rest. So it basically overlays the differences that you have added on top of the rest of the context. And then the only thing you need to do is to review the changes. And we all love reviewing and we all hate white blank pieces of paper, right? So yeah, that's how we're trying to improve that process.
Oh yeah, that's really fascinating. And it seems very complex. Are you involved in like the developing the tech behind it, or like you have a founding engineer who's mostly involved with that? Because the idea seems really complex, especially considering so many different factors.
I mean, we're a small team, and so everybody is involved in the product development. So there were a lot of things we needed and still need to learn. But I am involved in developing the product too.
That's fascinating. One thing I'm curious about is even like when I was doing research in my own lab, you would see some little variations between like how people do things or like how the equipment they use, right? And your platform obviously aims to standardize experimental documentation, right? How do you balance creating this like universal standard with the need for flexibility across different scientific fields and varying equipment, right? What challenges have you faced in making the platform both versatile and precise?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I feel like whenever people hear, well, myself included, hear standardize, we're like about to press the snooze button because it just is about to get really boring. We try to standardize in a different way. So usually standardization is for somebody else. It's either for the system, or it's for your boss, or it's so that your customer doesn't sue you, for example. But we apply standardization to improve the efficiency of communication again, right? So it comes in a lightweight format and it's quite flexible. We spent a couple of months testing different types of standardization, again, with the goal of making communication possible and better, and improving the format in which people communicate their procedural information. And we tested things like people searching for a specific bit of information without the documented process, or how much can you memorize based on this document that you provide you with, or how fast can you read through and understand the gist of it, right? So let me just talk you through a couple of aspects of the standardization that we have, so that we're on the same page about what does it actually mean for us. When we talk about procedural knowledge, what do you think is the most important pieces of information within that body of knowledge?
Like, I guess if you're talking about an experiment, you need to know like everything that you use and how much do you use, and the equipment you use. That's what comes to mind right now.
But like the keys, right? The most important pieces of information are actions, right? What is it you're doing? Because this is ultimately what you'll have to do. You'll have to take actions. Then, yes, you're absolutely right that the next layer of information that is important are parameters. So if I'm cooking a curry, how much cumin do I need to add, right? Like when you're going through a recipe, your eye would often go from right to left and left to right to understand that. So we're adding parameters right next to it, but separately, so that your eye can anchor on the actions, and only if you're interested in this particular action, you can go further into the parameter information. And then comes all of the auxiliary information about how your cocktail should look like in the end, or how you should tilt your pipette when you're applying this particular instance on top of this particular liquid, right? Or how do you whisk the egg with sugar in order to produce a meringue? I'm really getting hungry there.
I haven't had dinner too, so you're making me hungry as well. That's really interesting. So, just to clarify for myself, right? So, what you're trying to essentially what your focus is on what scientist does during an experiment, and you're trying to record that, so like the process itself is recorded instead of just like nitpicky details. Is that what I'm getting right? Or
yeah, so basically in the whole plethora of information about what happens in the lab, right, about the procedural knowledge, we're taking all of the pieces of information and we're structuring them in different visual representations. So we would have what the action is, and then we'll have a list of parameters. And then further on, we will have boxes of auxiliary information. And the steps will also be united into processes. So it's like we represent them as tube lines. Now you're in London, so you know what the pun, the meaning of the pun. So when I'm in the lab, or even when I'm in the kitchen, if I'm making a step in my head, there is a storyteller that is telling me this is a part of cell transfection. This is a part of, a culinary concept doesn't come into my mind right now, but you know what I mean? Like, so you know approximately which process you're doing right now. So that's this sort of standardization we're applying. And to go back to your question about how can it be scalable, I guess the flexibility allows it to be generalizable to other to different types of biology, to different types of operations, because we're not prescribing the scientist, this is the language you absolutely have to use. Vice versa, we're saying, you do what you got to do, and we got you. We'll just do the rest of the work for you, which is pretty, it's pretty neat to be able to not impose the labor onto the scientist who's doing the job.
That sounds like something that really massively increase your efficiency during the lab work, right? Which brings me to my next question: who are your target, customer segments? Is it the big pharma? Is it the individual scientists? Is it research groups, or is it just a mix of things? And whether you have any early adopters of your technology already?
Our target users I'll say users, not customers, are everybody who need to communicate their science and document their science so that they can understand it later on. But the reason why I said users is because we're free for academics, and we want to stay free for academics because we need to improve reproducibility, right? We think that there is a lot of room for communication within companies. So team-wide communication is much more frequent in industry than it is in academia, unfortunately, but it is what it is. And it's more abundant now than ever with the data science and robotics and all sorts of different fancy new functionalities that has been added to biotech and tech bios. So we see companies that have to have internal communication of experimental processes as our target customer persona, and the growing companies especially, because the earlier on you add proper processes, the more you'll thank yourselves later when people leave and you still have the knowledge, or you don't have the knowledge if they didn't write it down. Yeah, you also asked about the early adopters, right? We do have people using the tool from both industry and academia, which is quite nice. And they have been immensely helpful shaping the product, because obviously, the product has to be uniquely positioned to help people in the lab, and we're not in the lab right now. And so all of their feedback, all of their bug reports and asks for specific additions have been incredibly helpful.
But was it your opinion to keep it free for academics and individual scientists? Are you big on open source and kind of like data sharing?
We're very much so. I think science needs to be more open in general. There is so much value that open source brings, right? We don't have to go far. The software engineering community around the corner has shown us how much value there is in open source and collaboration, how much faster the progress can be. But unfortunately, in biology, it hasn't been so. And I think the reason for this is it costs much more to run an experiment in biology than it is to write code, right? To write code, you only need a laptop. To run an experiment, a biological experiment, you need quite a few things. But I hope going forward, it will gradually become more open too. There are more and more small tech bio companies. Over the past 5 years, there have been more and more companies in this space. And so there are more and more customers too. And you already see some companies like Crazel Bio sharing the work that they do internally that is not crucial for their internal processes. I guess it's still a business, so you need to keep your cards close to the chest. But there is so much more that can be shared. And if it's not shared, it's just left behind and nobody's ever going to make use of it. So it's great to see.
When you brings that up, and I have a separate question on the investment side, but when you bring that up, because usually, VC models are very much about the revenue and profits, right? Do you ever face any sort of like challenges where like they're like, oh, do you think we should do that? Or, like anybody going against that idea?
To be honest with you, not really, but we've been really lucky with the investors that we found. They have been, I'm not I'm not making it sound better than it actually is. We have been super lucky. And the investors that we're working with right now, who we raised money from, have been incredibly supportive, deep thinkers, and also thinking in tune with how we're thinking about this space as well. So yeah.
That's really nice.
It's really good. Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
It's really good to see that.
Yeah, that's actually amazing. I guess my next question would be, given the rise of AI-driven solutions in biotech, do you see potential for Briefly Bio to expand its product offerings or services to kind of, and branch out into other areas?
Yeah, AI is everywhere these days, isn't it? We're using LLMs for the standardization. LLM allows us to meet the scientists where they are already, right? So what I was saying before, that it wasn't possible previously to solve the communication at scale, was basically referring to this, that you can't put this burden on scientists. You have to make it easy for them. But taking a step back, I think the biggest challenge in biotech with AI is not AI itself, it's not that technology, is the lack of data, of good quality, comparable data. And it is true for drug discovery, protein therapeutics, etc. It's also true, maybe even more so, for experimental design, right? Because as we have talked about this, the information out there is very sparse and shallow. And so it's really difficult to mine that amount of information for really insightful patterns. Now, let's compare it to software engineering. AI is super helpful for software engineers, right? There is Cursor, like it's all around Twitter. It's really great. Why? Because there is so much code, and it's easy for having so much data to extract the patterns from all sorts of different programming languages, from all sorts of different algorithms, and then help your new software engineer to help her write whatever it is she intends to. But biology is about the physical world, and generally it's much more difficult about the physical world, isn't it? So whatever LLMs know about the physical world is whatever we have projected onto language and gave to AI. So that's a challenge. Also, unlike with image, video, and video data, it is expensive to generate biological data. Also, there are so many parameters that you can change. So if I run an experiment and Natasha runs an experiment, our experiments might not be comparable just because we changed one parameter. So that stuff. I think that has to be the main goal, improving the data so that we can A, improve the hypothesis generation exercise, and B, improve the experiment generation exercise. And this is something we want to do it briefly, right? Making sure that people troubleshoot less and get to the results that they want faster with better experiments.
People in science, they've been doing the same thing for years and years. They have their own methods, and once you get used to something, it's very hard to change your behavior, right? So, do you face any challenge, even though your technology might ease their life like 1,000 times? It's still, you feel a bit different switching to something completely new. Do you feel like a kind of like a resistance in adoption, or do you think people are very much open-minded in trying something new because everybody share the same sentiment as you do about this reproducibility?
That's an excellent question. And I think generally behavior changes is the most difficult task when you're creating something slightly different from the products that are out there. I think with scientists in particular, it is challenging because there is so much complexity and uncertainty already. And when you want to change a behavior, you have to have extra headspace, right? Because when you change, any change is uncertainty. Uncertainty is where the danger lives. So it feels like that's why maybe the space is a bit slower than your general space on adoption of new behaviors and new tools, right? But also, I guess, when you're adding something new, there are two things that you want to address. First, you want to be within the headspace that coexists with the task that they're about to do. So when they think, I need to write up this experiment for Michael, what shall I use? And we will be in their heads next to Google Docs, Notion, physical lab notebook, whiteboard, other ELNs, etc. So you want to be there. We want to make sure that briefly is one of the options. But then second, you want to be picked. And in order to be picked, you need to really understand the problem and solve it better than other solutions, right? So that one is hard as well because people don't tell you what they need. People don't like to talk about problems again because there is a lot of uncertainty there. They like to talk about solutions, especially scientists, and they'll tell you what they want, exactly what they want, and then it will turn out it's not actually.
I mean, starting a company is challenging. Every entrepreneur says the same thing, but I feel like starting a company at the intersection of tech and bio is extra difficult, especially for the challenges you mentioned. I'm interested. You already mentioned a couple of them. You touched upon a couple of them, but I'm interested in the kind of brief timeline of when you started and really at the inception of the company, when you were just founding the team and trying to establish kind of like the mission and the vision, what were the main challenges you faced? Especially because you're a scientist first and foremost, right? You come from a science background, and now suddenly you're an entrepreneur. So what challenges you faced?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I learned a lot at my previous company. I worked alongside with exceptionally smart people who have taught me a lot. If I were to start this gig right after academia, I mean, like, no, I'm not, I wouldn't be able to do it. There is a lot of extra stuff that you need to be aware of. And the other aspect is I'm not doing this alone, and I never would. I'm doing this with two other people who are there to catch me, with my blind spots, and who have very different backgrounds, different experiences, and I'm teaching from them every day too. Learning from them every day too. But going back to your question about the journey, I left the previous company that I worked for, which what year it was? It must have been April 22. Yes, it was April 22. And then startup journeys are quite a ride. So I had to take a bit of a break. I consulted a bit, but I was basically taking it easy for half a year. And around the same time, these other two people led the company too. So we were having a holiday together, and we were just discussing what are the problems that we care about in science and just generally in the world, because they were in a similar kind of mindset as me, just taking it easy and seeing what it is they want to do next. And then it took a lot of talking. Like it took a lot of like discussions and getting to the bottom of it, because whenever you start to discuss something, or like even thinking about it yourself, there is so much work to do, so many thoughts to think that other people have already thought. Do you know what I mean? Like people in this space, obviously they have thought these thoughts before, but you have to go through this journey yourself too. And you have to get on the same page with two other people. So it does take quite a bit of time. I think getting to clarity, and it still is a challenge every single time, because as a startup, you're constantly working in the lack of information environment. So getting to clarity is a constant challenge. Just being like, this is what we got to do. Test, learn, and then, yeah.
It's very fair. What you mentioned about your co-founders, it seems like you have an amazing team, and it's really important. You said you would never do it alone, so you always need a team, right? And you've been doing this for a while now. So my question is, like when you're planning to start a company and you're looking for co-founders, like what you should really look for in your co-founders, so the team is cohesive and you guys can move forward. Because entrepreneurship is like a bit like marriage, right? It's not in 1 year, it's not
More
2 years.
intense. Yeah.
It's probably more intense. Exactly. There's a lot at stake, and it's not like 1 year, 2 years thing. It's a sometimes 10 to 15 year journey, right? So what advice would you have regarding that?
Searching for a co-founder. I mean, if you can try to work with them, like try. This is the best case scenario. I was lucky enough to have worked with both of them, and I really enjoyed the process, because I'm sure there are like different bits, different tricks that every single person develops throughout their life, when they can say like, oh yeah, it's going to be easy for me to work with this person, or difficult to work with this person. But it's only through working together that you can really test that. You gotta trust them, and you gotta like them, and you gotta want to spend a long,
Long
long amount of time with.
together. Fair. Um, the market is getting pretty competitive, but you started this some time ago now, so you're not one of the recent AI companies. You've been doing it for a while now. Um, but obviously also like again, VCs ride on hype cycles too, and AI and LLMs are like a huge thing right now, so everybody's trying to get a piece of that. How was your experience with raising funding and just getting interest from VCs, from investors? Did you try to get grant funding, or did you try to like just target the VCs? Or did you try to bootstrap initially? Like, how's that? How was the process?
Right. We did try to bootstrap initially. We did consulting, all three of us, or some of us individually, trying to help other startups because we were there quite early on. The company we worked for previously was one of the first in the tech bio wave, AI for protein engineering. So we felt like maybe there is something we can help other people avoid in their journeys. But we couldn't do it the full way. So at some point we realized that either we consult or we build, because otherwise the skis are moving in different directions. And so we started talking to some VCs that we knew from before, from our previous careers, and starting to shape up the pitch deck and looking at the vision. And one thing led to another, you know how it is. And at some point, our CEO, Harry, was talking to a lot of people every week. And then we found the right fit.
Right there. I've talked to a couple of people, and some say, you got to kind of adjust your pitch deck for an investor. And some people say you just got to stay true to your pitch deck, right? You don't change your pitch deck. Whether they like it or they don't like it, you just, you form your pitch deck, you polish it, obviously, but you don't have to adjust it. What's your opinion on that when it comes to shaping the pitch deck?
I mean, with any communication, you got to know who you're talking to.
Right.
So maybe, it depends on the pitch deck. Maybe you don't change the slides, but maybe you should change the story slightly. So that you're like the person, you acknowledge the person that you're talking to. It's always nice to feel acknowledged, isn't it?
Yeah.
And these are just, people. We're all people, and we like to be seen. So
exactly.
If you're selling, you gotta know who you're selling to. You gotta account for that.
That's very fair. I guess more conceptual question: what role do you see AI playing, in the future of biotech? Do you think we are kind of potentially moving towards a future where AI becomes a core researcher?
Yeah, I ask this question to myself every now and then. It's interesting. The world we're living in is very interesting, isn't it? As I said, though, data, we got to get there first. So if you look at how useful LLMs have been to a software engineer compared to a biologist, it's not comparable. So much more useful for the software engineer than the biologist. But then the question is, will AI substitute the biologist in the lab first, or in the hypothesis generation room, and my bet is the former is going to happen. So first, probably, we'll see more and more robots in the lab, and we'll see more and more automated labs. But we're still far away from there, I'm pretty sure.
That's fair. You've touched upon the data sync quite a bit of times, and I'm very interested. How do you think there are any tangible ways of providing really good, obviously data? Not every data set is good. Some of them might be really large, but they might have a lot of noise and all that. Do you have any, things in mind on how we can really increase the quantity of data available in the biospace?
I think it's just about time, right? Like, we never had to. Well, first of all, maybe 20 years ago, we didn't generate so much data as we do now in biology. With NGS, next generation sequencing, it just exploded, and it's growing and growing and growing, right? With more robotics, more automation, more high throughput techniques, we're getting more and more and more data. Obviously, I'm interested in the procedural side, right? Very much, because you can have 100,000 million data points, but then you don't know how they were generated, and how do you compare them? How do you label them, right? So you have to be mindful of how the data has been generated. Again, we're coming back to the beginning of the conversation, right? Like, you have to make sure that all of the meta information about the data that you have generated is captured and can be looked back on a year ago, a year later, 2 years later, etc., etc. Also, I think about procedural information as data too, right? Because you can also predict better experiment. Like, okay, you look at you have composed some sort of an experiment plan, and then you want to know, is this likely to work? What other people are using? Are people are using this temperature or that temperature? right now, there's not enough data to do that for absolute majority of the experiments. And we tried, we tested.
What milestones do you have so far, and like what's like next 5 to 10 years looks like for Briefly Bio?
5 to 10 years.
I mean, you decide the length of time. I'm just curious, like what future milestones you have for your company.
I mean, right now we need to build a product that people love, right? That people go back to and talk to their friends about, not because their boss told them to. It's not being sold top down into the companies, but rather because it makes their lives easier. So I guess that's the main goal. And moving into the future, we want to make the process more and more easy, right? Improving the quality of the experiments that people write up and run, but also improving the sharing process. So we want to, at some point, get to a place where we have built a GitHub for science where people can build on top of each other's work easily, share what they have done easily, and have version control.
It's fascinating. I really hope. I mean, it seems like a fantastic idea, and I really hope it works out just the way you want it to work out. I will continue to follow up on the success of your company. This really sounds amazing. I guess my final question would be, there are a bunch of people who are looking to start a company, especially now. We see a bunch more PhDs with the organizations like Nucleate and all other things, becoming more and more interested in entrepreneurship instead of pursuing academia, right? So I guess what advice would you give to people who want to start a company, especially your in a sector like yours, like it's a scientific software, right? What advice would you give to them?
I think you have to start with a problem, right? Always. So I think the best products are built by people who have felt the pain themselves. And so why is this important, right? Not only because they will probably fight harder because they actually felt this pain, so they want to soothe it, but also because they have the unique insight into the problem that they want to solve. And so generally, I think that that's a good place to start from. And the other aspect, I think we touched on this before, the market, the area, biotech area is quite slow in adoption. So you have to make sure you have enough runway and patience and that you're willing to learn, but not like in a very meticulous scientific way, right? Rather, you try something, you throw it at people and you see if it sticks or not. Because if you can learn, if your strong opinions held lightly, if you're willing to learn, then quantity does translate into quality at some point, because you get so much more information. Like we were talking about data throughout this podcast. This is also about data, right? You want to generate as much as possible.
Very true. So essentially what you're saying is develop, provide the product, get feedback, reiterate, develop, provide the product, and do it like in a cyclical way, right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, yeah.
Katya, it's been a very informative, conversation. I genuinely appreciate your time. And I can't wait to hear more, hopefully in a year or two, about your company. But again, thank you so much for your time. It was a lot.
Thanks, Javid. Thanks for inviting me. It was a lot of fun.
I'm glad. Have a great evening.
Yeah, you too.